So if your Bibles, please turn to Daniel chapter 6. And while you're turning there, I imagine most of you have a desire to want to live a life of faithfulness to the Lord. And I imagine most of you want to live with integrity. If that's really the desire of your heart, then I have to tell you very clearly that you're going to be facing Satan and his attacks against you, with a desire by Satan to try to get you to compromise your faith. And there's a variety of ways that Satan will try to get you to compromise your faith. And I want to share what I would call two of the methods that Satan does this. The first method that we see how Satan does that is through seduction. By enticing you and I with the desires and the pleasures of this world, Satan will look to seduce and lead us away from living a life that is dependent upon God. In fact, the closer we get to Jesus' return, the more we're going to see people falling prey to Satan's seductive schemes. This is what it says in 1 Timothy 4:1. It says, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful or seducing spirits and the teachings of demons." So look, I'm going to stop right here. I want to remind you, if your desire is to walk with integrity, your desire is to live for Christ, one of the things Satan's going to do is try to entice you with the things of this world, to get you to compromise and to get you to have the desires of your heart long for the things of this world, rather than long for Jesus Christ. A second method that Satan will use besides seduction is persecution. So throughout the history of the church, we have seen Satan attack believers through violent persecution. And the purpose of doing this is to discourage and wear down people's faith in Jesus Christ, is to wear down the saints. And for those who face this type of method of Satan, they're forced to decide whether they're going to endure the persecution or they're going to compromise their faith because of the pressures around them. And that pressure may be to the extent of giving their very lives for Jesus Christ. Now here in America, our greatest challenge is not from persecution, but from seduction. But listen to me. You will still face a level of persecution here in America. It may be only to the scale of being ridiculed or rejected by your faith in Jesus, by your friends, your family, your coworkers. But the reality is, if you're choosing to walk with Christ, you're choosing to be faithful and have integrity in your walk, then it says very clearly in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12, that all who desire to live a godly life in Jesus Christ will be persecuted. Now, I'm sharing this with you because I want you to grasp the fact that you're in a battle that's designed to pull you away from following Christ. And right now, Satan will use these methods in your life to try to get you to compromise, to try to get you to walk away from him. But it's not just the reality of what we face that is at the heart of what the book of Daniel is all about. You see, Daniel, he faced these two methods of attack by Satan. He was seduced. If you remember, he was offered to eat of the delicacies from the king's table. When he went to Babylon, the king said, "Here's all the greatness of the kingdom. Daniel, it's all at your disposal if you want." And not only was he seduced with the things of the world, but he was also persecuted. He was attacked, as we'll see in our passage today, for his religious beliefs, for his faith in the God that he served. But here's the thing. As he faced both of these, he never wavered, he never compromised, but he remained faithful and obedient to God. And what gave Daniel the ability to do that? Because let's just be honest. Every day we're facing these challenges, right? We're facing what? Being seduced by the world. We're facing some level of persecution. I've heard many of you, even parents, say, "My children are making decisions I don't agree with, and I'm being told if I don't accept that decision they're making, they don't want me to be part of their lives." So we're all facing this. How do we maintain our integrity before the Lord when he's coming to our path? What was it for Daniel? Well, I'll tell you this. It was not Daniel trusting his own integrity and character. As much as he was a man of integrity, he did not survive these methods of attack by Satan by trusting in himself. Rather, listen, it was by trusting in the character and the integrity of the God that he served. When I opened up our study of the book of Daniel, I was very clear that there are three truths about God's character that impacted the way Daniel lived. Every situation he faced, whether he was being seduced or being persecuted, these truths about God defined how he was going to navigate that situation. And I want to lay those out for you. Because as they are helpful to Daniel, they'll be helpful to you and I, whether we're facing seduction or persecution by Satan himself. So the first of these character qualities about God that Daniel lived by is the fact that God is sovereign. In other words, Daniel walked in complete trust that God was not just in control of the world around him, but God was in control of the smallest details of his life, and he lived in light of that truth. Secondly, he understood that God is faithful. Despite the unfaithfulness of those around him, even his own unfaithfulness, he knew that God would always remain faithful to what he promised. And the third truth about God that defined Daniel's life is this, that God is redemptive. Daniel had a hope and a trust in a future day when God would come back and redeem this broken world from the curse of the fall. And see, these three truths, the fact that God is sovereign, that he is faithful, that he is redemptive, they enabled Daniel to approach a den of lions with complete confidence that God would be his refuge and deliverer. And I want to stop right here because as we think about this, let me ask you in your life. I know maybe you're not going to be facing literal lions in your own life, but I promise you, you're going to face some form of lions in your life, seeking to destroy you, your family, your marriage. And the question is, what will sustain you? Because do you have this perspective like Daniel? That he knew clearly the character of the God that he served, that even as he's going into the den of lions, he knew that God would be his refuge, that God would be his deliverer. And so with that backdrop, I just want to, before we pick up with verse 16, just kind of shape the context. Because last week, if you weren't here, we looked at the first 15 verses of chapter 6. And let me just briefly give you some highlights. We talked at the beginning of chapter 6 how there was a power change. The Babylonian Empire was the greatest empire at that time, but the Medes and the Persians came and they conquered Babylon. And with this transition of power, the Persian king Darius, he begins to set up a new form of government, a government that would roll over the land that they just conquered. And guess who he wants to make his most trusted advisor, the ruler behind him over everyone else, would be Daniel. And so the other advisors get jealous because how could he want to put Daniel above them? So they start a campaign to destroy Daniel's character. And as we saw last week, that in this midst of the smear campaign against Daniel, he has such a level of integrity they could find nothing to accuse him of except for his faithfulness to the God that he served. And so what do? They form a plot, and they go and deceive the king to get the king to pass a law that for 30 days no one can pray to anyone except for the king. And if anyone broke this law, guess what the punishment would be? He'd be thrown into a den of lions. Now Daniel's character has been shaped before this moment, so Daniel does what? He doesn't compromise. Daniel continues his regular pattern of praying 3 times a day to God with his window open. And of course, Daniel's accusers knew that Daniel would not compromise, so they see him praying. They go to the king and accuse Daniel of breaking this law. And this king, Darius, he loved Daniel. He was his most trusted advisor, so he spent the whole day trying to find a way to save Daniel, but we ended last week with what? The king failed. He could not find a way to save Daniel from the law that he signed. And that's where we're going to stop, because what we're going to see right here is that what the king is unable to do for Daniel, God is able to do. So let's pick up here with verse 16. This is what we read. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God whom you serve continually deliver you." So I already mentioned before, the king was unsuccessful in trying to save Daniel. And so being unsuccessful, what does he do? He realizes the only thing he can appeal to is Daniel's God. He's powerless himself to save Daniel, so he's going to appeal to Daniel's God to save him. And I just want you to understand, this is such a powerful picture. Because Darius does not believe in Daniel's God, but what he recognizes is that Daniel is consistent. He is faithful in his trust in this God, and so based upon that, he's like, maybe your God will come and save you, Daniel, because you've been faithful to him. And this is such a big, important point, because I want you to grasp this. It's Daniel's consistent faithfulness to God that leaves a powerful impression upon this king and upon the other people who watched how he lived. And it's a key element that you and I must have in our own lives. We need to have a good testimony for Jesus, and the way to do it is that we must make sure that we have a consistent walk with him, not a conditional walk with him. Let me explain the difference. Some people today have what I call conditional faith, a conditional walk with God. And this reflects people who serve God based upon the conditions of their life. So when the conditions or circumstances of life are going well, when God is giving them what they feel that they deserve, then they will serve God. But once those conditions change, and they're no longer seen in their eyes as being favorable to them, guess what else changes? Their loyalty and obedience to God changes as well. And because of this, a person with conditional faith, they leave a testimony to the world of a God who is incapable of protecting us during the storms of life. You know people like that in your own life, right? You have people who say, I'm your best friend, I'm always there for you, but as soon as a tragedy or trial comes, they're the last one that's there, right? That's how sometimes we approach God. It's like, God, you're there whenever I need you, but whenever things are going well, I'm just going to walk away. Or when things don't go the way I want, I'm going to walk away. And the reality is, I'm going to tell you something. If you have a conditional faith today, what people are seeing in your life right now is that you serve a God who is not able to protect you during the storms of life. But in contrast to a conditional faith, we see Daniel having a consistent faith. So what's a consistent faith? It reflects people who serve God regardless of the circumstances in their life. And both the good and the bad, And the trials and victories of life, they remain faithful and obedient and devoted to God. And because of this, guess what testimony they show to the world? That they serve a God who is truly a shelter and a refuge in the storms of life. Just be honest. Who are some of the people that inspired you the most in their walk with the Lord? It's not when times are going well, but it's when their life is falling apart, when it seems like there is no hope. But in the midst of it, they are so consistent in their faithfulness to God that they'll walk faithful to God no matter what. And the reality before all of us is this, and maybe this is a self-reflection question. What type of God does your life display to others? What type of testimony are you providing? What do they see in the good times and the bad times? What God are you portraying to them? Because I hope and pray like Daniel, you are shown that you serve a God that even when the good times or even in the bad times, my God that I serve is still faithful to get me through it. So we pick up here in verse 17. And it says, this, and a stone was brought and laid in the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. So we're not exactly sure what this den of lions looks like. I was just talking to someone after the first service. They said, did you find historical evidence? We don't really know what it looked like. Some scholars believe it was an underground pit. But what we do find out is that at this time, there was a practice that the Persians followed that was called royal lion hunting. One source that I read referred to this as a sport of the kings. So what happened is these ancient kings would go on these royal lion huntings to hunt and capture lions. And it was important for them to do that because it was a symbolic way of showing the people that they served over that I am not only brave, I have the power to protect you. And so these kings would go on these lion hunts. Once they would capture the lions, they would place them into an enclosed area, like a pit, to be used for purposes of both punishment and for public entertainment. And so most likely, Daniel was placed into one of these enclosures that these lions were captured from these royal lion hunting expeditions. And so we see that Daniel's cast into the den. A stone is placed over it, that it is sealed with both the signet ring of the king and of the other rulers. In other words, they're placing their stamp of approval to say that no one can break this seal. If they do, they will face the same punishment of the one who the seal is covering over. And so then we pick up in verse 18. And the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So here's Daniel. He's in a lion's den. And while he's there, guess what the king is doing? He's back in his palace having a restless night. In fact, that restless night prompts him to know he doesn't want any food. He doesn't want his usual nightly entertainment, which would include music and dancing. And you can think of other things that would happen in those types of nightly entertainment. He doesn't want anything. He's a wreck. He can't sleep. He is so upset about his most trusted advisor, Daniel. But here's the funny thing. While the king could not sleep, we find Daniel had a very restful night in that den of lions. In fact, Daniel spent a far more comfortable night in a den with lions than Darius did in his palace filled with all the luxuries of the world. Do you get that? Daniel's showing us that I can be in the worst situation, but I can still have peace in regards to the people over here who have everything that the world offers that says gives you peace. And see, the reality is this. Sometimes, man, we are like Daniel, right? We face difficulties. We face challenges. But no matter what we may encounter, the peace that Daniel had while in that lion's den is the same peace that you and I can experience. A peace that, listen to me, transcends our circumstances. The peace I'm talking about that Daniel had, it didn't just happen before the lion's den. It happened through the lion's den and even after. It was a peace that transcended what he was facing. The other day, a person came into my office. This individual is facing what I would call a significant challenge in life that has brought extreme pain and hurt. And as we were talking, I looked over to this person. I said, if there's one thing that I can pray for you as you go through this, what would it be? And they said, pray for me to have peace. How many of you can relate to that? Like you're in a situation right now, you're like, look at Pastor, there's one thing I want right now. I need peace. This situation is wearing me down. It's breaking me down. It's discouraging me. I feel a sense of just fear and hopelessness. Pastor, just pray for me like that person you prayed for, that I will find peace. And the reality is, you know what? We can't experience that peace just like Daniel did. Because while we may not face literal lions, we will face lions in this world, won't we? And how do we have that peace that Daniel had? How do we have a peace that transcends the circumstances that we're in? Very clearly, like Daniel, we have to keep our minds focused upon God and not the things of this world. That's why I go back to Daniel had a clear picture of the character of God. And that clear picture of who God is, it sustained him in the midst of what he was going through. That's why I love this verse. This is Isaiah chapter 26, verse 3, and it says the following. You keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. And just like Daniel, no matter what you may be going through right now, you can have that same peace that transcends what you are facing. We go into verse 19, this is what we read. Then at break of day, the king arose. He went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So I just picture, here's Darius, the king. He's got a restless night, right? There he is, just sitting on the edge of his bed all night, just waiting for the sun to rise. Because he knows as soon as that sun rises, he's going to rush over to that den to see and check on the welfare of his most trusted advisor. Because the thing I want you to understand is this. Even though Darius does not believe in Daniel's God, his respect for Daniel and the integrity and the deep faith that Daniel had in the God he served is providing Darius that evening some glimmer of hope that Daniel will still be alive when he goes there. Do you see the power of what that faith does? It's such a powerful example that to a pagan king who does not believe in Daniel's God, that Daniel has such a level of integrity, such a deep faith and trust in God, that has given this king some glimmer of hope that Daniel will still be alive. And so as Darius comes to that den, rather than hearing the sound of silence, we read in verse 21 and 22 that Darius hears the voice of his most trusted advisor, Daniel. It says, Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. And they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. You see, I love his response, because his response to the king is very clear. First of all, he approaches the king with such great respect, doesn't he? In fact, he says, O king, live forever. In other words, I pray that you have a long life. It's quite interesting because he could be complaining to the king, arguing, like, how dare you, king, put me in here? I did nothing wrong to you, and here you've done throwing me in this den of lions. Is that not usually our first response? Like, how dare you be unjust to me? How dare you treat me like that? But here's Daniel. He is showing clear respect to this king. Why? Because it goes more than just the fact that he's a man of integrity. It is a recognition that his life is under the sovereign control of God. That Darius doesn't determine his outcome. God determines his outcome. I mean, think about it. I'm sure many of us have been in a similar situation like Daniel, maybe not to that extent, but we always say, God, why are you making me go through this? Because God has the power to remove it from us, doesn't he? I mean, God has the power to spare Daniel from this whole ordeal. God has the power to make sure he does not go into that pit of lions. But God chose to have Daniel go through it. So the fact that Daniel had to spend a night in the lion's den, listen to me, this is so powerful, it was no surprise to Daniel. Do you hear what I'm saying? The fact that he was there was no surprise. Why? Because Daniel knew two things. He knew, first of all, that why certain things happen in this life when we're faithful to God. He understood that. But more importantly, he also knew that when they happened, who was in control. He knew the God that he served was in control. Look, I got to stop back. Even for me as a pastor, this is deep. To know that no matter what I'm going to go through, that I surrender myself to a point that I have such trust in God that I realize in this life, God, I'll go through difficulties. I get the why. But more than that, God, I know who's in control. And I will not lose my peace. Because I know where my peace comes from. It comes from you and not my circumstances. So Daniel then goes on to affirm that God is the one who delivered him. He sent his angel to shut the mouths of the lions. We don't know the exact identity of the angels. I've seen things from Gabriel to Michael the archangel to Jesus himself. We don't know who that person was. But one thing that angel shows us is that God had not abandoned Daniel. Darius the king, right? What did he do to Daniel? He abandoned him. He left him there to spend the whole night in that den of lions, a man who was faithful to Darius as his most trusted advisor. But what Darius did to leave him alone, guess what? God was still with Daniel the whole time. And to me, this is another important point, because we're all going to face moments where we felt abandoned by others, right? There are going to be moments, and even if you have a close relationship with your husband and wife, your children, it doesn't matter. There are going to be moments in your life where you're going to feel like, I have just been abandoned by everyone. That you're going through a situation, you're like, man, it just seems like no one understands what I'm going through, or no one really cares. The depth of that situation has made you feel all alone. But regardless of whatever pit or den of lions you may be facing, listen, I'll tell you this. And no matter who may abandon you in the midst of it, God's still present in the midst of it. You know, the text doesn't tell you and I what Daniel was doing that night in the lion's den. Some people say he was sleeping peacefully. Others say he was praising God. I'm sure he's doing both. I'll give you my opinion. It's just my opinion, all right? I believe that Daniel was declaring the truth of Psalm 91. It's a great psalm. It's a psalm that I would tell you, if you ever go through a difficult time, you're facing some trouble in life, it is a psalm for you to go to just to read the power of what the psalm says. And I want to share a few verses from this psalm that I think not only speaks powerfully about God's presence and protection over his people, but it has such great parallels to what Daniel was facing. If you want to read it on your own, do it after the sermon, okay? And I did Psalm 91 last year. You can go on YouTube and listen to the whole sermon. But I want to open up with verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 91. And this is what it says. It says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." Now listen, it opens up by saying, for those who dwell with God, for those who have placed their trust in God, God will what? He will be present with them when troubles and difficulties come. Now listen, as a pastor, I can't tell you that God will be that for all of you in this room. That's what the passage says. The passage says he is there for those who dwell with him. In fact, who dwell in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty. How far have you ever tried to run away from your shadow? Not too good, right? That's how close you need to be with God. When you have that intimate, personal relationship with God on a daily basis, God is saying, I will be your refuge, I will be your fortress. Then we go on to read in verse 11 and 12 that in those times of trouble, this is what God will do for us. It says, for he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. So as we dwell with God, we're going to receive the blessing, just like Daniel did, of angelic protection. In fact, these verses point out that angels are always on guard. They're ready to respond to God's command on our behalf. They're like a parent who lifts a child who has been hurting. They will lift us up when we are in trouble. How many times have we not noticed when God has intervened by sending an angel on our behalf? Who knows how many times that may have happened without us even knowing? Then we go on in verse 13. It says, you will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion, the serpent you will trample underfoot. Now listen, when I gave this sermon on Psalm 91, I didn't tell people to go out and literally start to fight lions. That's not the point. In Daniel's case, yeah, it was a real lion. But the point of what the psalmist is trying to say is this is metaphorical for the enemies in your life. That means when people rise up to destroy you, to destroy your family, to destroy your marriage, God says when you dwell in my presence, guess what? I will intervene on your behalf. I will give you victory over your enemies. Man, is that a truth? It's the power of what we see when we dwell with God. That not only is his presence there, but his victory is always available for us as well. So we go back to Daniel chapter 6. We also see in verses 21 and 22 that not only has God saved Daniel, but Daniel has also been seen as to be innocent before God. That means he's pure and consistent in his walk before God. And not only that, he has done nothing to harm the king. In other words, yes, Daniel did break the king's law. Yes, he did. But listen to me very clear. He did not do it out of disloyalty to the king or to the king's interest, but out of obedience to God. One of the things I always hear as a pastor, when do you think it comes to the point where we as a congregation should disobey the government? I'll simply tell you this. When the government calls you to do that which is disobedient to God, and you do it out of obedience to God, not out of disloyalty to the government. You see what motivates you? It's obedience to God. I surrender to God. I honor God. My integrity is still there, but I don't do it to defy or to try to attack or destroy the government. I do it because of my devotion to the God that I serve. We pick up here in verse 23. It says, then the king was exceedingly glad. He commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he trusted in his God. You know, I've read this passage so many times, and usually when I get it, I'm like, okay, good. Daniel's pulled out of the den. But you know how powerful that act of him being pulled out of that den is? You see, he was given capital punishment. That means you're not getting out of that den, Daniel. You're going to be dead. And by Darius taking him out of that den, it highlights two things we need to keep in mind about Daniel. And here's the first one, that Daniel was innocent. You see, Darius recognized that Daniel's life had been placed in the hands of God to determine whether he was guilty or innocent. And in the den of lions, guess what God declared? He said, Daniel, you are innocent. In fact, you know what's powerful? You know what Daniel's name actually means? God is my judge. And as Daniel's judge, God has looked upon Daniel and says, you are innocent. The second thing it highlights about Daniel is not just his innocence, but it highlights Daniel's faith. The passage says, no harm was found on Daniel because he had trusted in who? In God. And I want to make a very important point here. I want you to understand this. It was not Daniel's faith that saved him. Somehow we've bought in the church that if you have enough faith, you can do all these wonderful things, and it's your faith that matters most. And I'm not saying that faith's not important, but what is more important is not my faith, it's the object of my faith. And it's the object of Daniel's faith that saved him, that he had what? A faith and a trust in God. You see, we all place our faith and trust in something, don't we? But the key for us is not whether we have faith or trust, because we all do. It is whom we place our faith and trust in. And Daniel had placed his faith and trust in God, and he knew that God had the power to save him. And because of his faith in God, we see in this passage the truth of what it says in Hebrews 11, verse 33. It says, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. What a great picture to see in this thing, not only the innocence of Daniel, but to see the depth of his faith. Not just a faith in anything, but a faith in the right object in God himself. We move on to verse 24. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So while Daniel was declared to be innocent, we see that his accusers were found to be guilty. And please understand, their punishment was not a result of Daniel seeking revenge. Their punishment came from Darius as a consequence of their decision to deceive and manipulate the king. And as was a custom in ancient Persia, when a person defied the king this way, guess what? It not only cost them their life, but the lives of their entire family. It should be a reminder to you and I that on a lesser scale, the choices that we make will impact our children and our grandchildren. That you reap what you sow, not just personally, but you reap that within generations after you. And we need to be mindful of that. And one thing about this passage, besides learning from them, the other thing I love about this is that people often say, oh, come on, the lions weren't very hungry. That's why Daniel survived. Just so you know, there's no natural explanation, but it's divine intervention. What does the passage say? That before these people hit the ground, their bodies were torn apart by the lions. I want you to grasp this picture or grasp this truth from this verse right here, is that it should be a warning to you and I that we should never be involved in any deceptive scheme that promotes evil. And maybe on a lower scale, that means going on social media, gossiping and maligning people, not just outside the church, but within the church. We should not be involved with that. Because I want you to understand, there's a truth that will come back to haunt you like it does here. And it's very clearly laid out in Proverbs chapter 26, verse 27. And this is what it says. Whoever digs a pit or a den will fall into it, and a stone will come back on him who starts it rolling. Let God be your advocate and your defender, rather than you trying to maliciously attack and destroy people. We go on in verse 25, and this is what we read. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, the nations, and the languages that dwell on all the earth. He says, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. I mean, it's just like we go back to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, right? We're seeing the same thing. The passage of chapter 6 opens up with what? The king is giving a decree that no one can pray to any God except for me. And if you do that in 30 days, you're going to go to a lion's den and die. And now what we see is this powerful transition in our story. Because now he issues another decree, and the decree is no longer about the king. Who's it about? Daniel's God. Because he says to all the people in his kingdom that all of you are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. And part of that decree we see continues on in verse 26 and 27, because this is what the king says. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. What a great picture. And it's a consistent pattern in the book of Daniel. Before it was King Nebuchadnezzar, right? Over the Babylon Empire. Now it's Darius over the Persian Empire. It shows you once again how God brought the rulers of mighty empires to a point where they acknowledge the greatness and power of him and the fact that his kingdom, not theirs, will last forever. This is the God that we serve. And just like in Daniel's life, God can work in our lives to be a testimony to who God truly is. And then we go to verse 28 and we see how this chapter closes. It says the following. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That Hebrew word for prosper can also be translated successful. And if you think about it, Daniel's taken as an exile to Babylon, then serves under the Persian Empire as well. And he was very successful. He was placed in positions of leadership. He was able to live in the palace. All these great, ways of prospering and being successful. But please understand, ladies and gentlemen, that is not the heart of Daniel's success. It was not what he gained as a ruler or the benefits that came with that. If I had to say to you the greatest evidence of Daniel's success is this: how God used him to be a beacon of light for both the Babylonian and Persian empires. You see, the way he lived his life with such integrity, he became a living reflection of the God that he served. And you know how powerful that was? Daniel just didn't impact people while he was alive, but his testimony carried on. Because there's a story later in the Gospel of Matthew that talks about these magi. We refer to them as wise men who come from the east to visit who? Jesus in Bethlehem. And what scholars tell us is that the reason that they came is because they were influenced by a person by the name of Daniel. You see the impact of what a person can do. And this is my question to you all, is this: what type of impact are you having upon those around you? Are you being a light to point them to Jesus? Because right now, your life, like Daniel, it is being examined and being evaluated, and it's having an impact upon people. And the question is it like Daniel? Is it drawing people to Jesus Christ, or is it pushing them away? I hope and pray, like Daniel, that you are being a beacon of light in this dark world that God is using to draw people to Christ because of the way that you live. So we come to our conclusion here. You think about in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, you and I have learned a lot about how to live with integrity. We have learned a lot about how not to conform to the culture around us. But I want you to understand, as much as those are important, they're not the depth of what we've learned in the first 6 chapters. Because the depth of what we have learned over the last 6 chapters is this: it is not about how we are to live, but whom we are to live for. You see, you think about all the stories about Daniel, they lead us to one person, and his name is Jesus Christ. And perhaps I can see no greater example of this than in the story of Daniel's in the lion's den. Because this story, listen to me, it is a foreshadowing of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want to give you some parallels that we see between Daniel in the lion's den and we see in the life of Jesus, who went to a cross and rose from a grave. These are some powerful parallels. I'm only going to give you a few. There's much more than this. Here's the first one. Both Daniel and Jesus faced a plot by their enemies to destroy them. Both Daniel and Jesus were falsely accused, and they were brought before a ruler. Both of them were sentenced to death, even though they were declared innocent. In the case of Daniel, King Darius places a stone over the den and seals it with his ring. When it comes to Jesus, a stone's placed over his tomb, and it is sealed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. In the case of Daniel, Darius goes early in the morning to the den to see about his friend. In the case of Jesus, the women go early in the morning to check the tomb. In the case of Daniel, Darius finds that Daniel is still alive. In the case of Jesus, the women and others find that he is alive and has risen from the grave. Powerful parallels. But I want you to know this, that while we see similar parallels in these two stories, the outcomes are quite different. You see, when Daniel came out of the lion's den, he was the only one delivered by God. However, when Jesus Christ came out of that tomb, not only was he delivered, but all those who placed their faith and trust in him. You think about what Jesus Christ has done for you and I. We no longer stand guilty and condemned as sinners before a holy and righteous God. But because of what he does, we place our faith and trust in him. We stand before God forgiven and declared innocent. Paul says it so very well in Romans 8, verse 1. He says, there is therefore no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Because of what Jesus Christ does, because he conquered that grave, you and I no longer have to be condemned before God, but we can be forgiven. And that leaves to one question and one challenge before we go to prayer. And here's the question. Please listen to me, because I don't know the spiritual state of anybody in this room. Only God knows your heart. And here's the greatest question you'll ever hear in your life, and this is this. Have you placed your faith and trust in Jesus and been set free from the punishment of your sin? Have you? And if you haven't today, it is very simple. It is to repent of your sin. What does repentance mean? It means I stop living for myself. I turn away from living for myself, and I turn and I follow Jesus Christ and what he's done for me. And if you have come to that point where you have repented of your sin to follow Jesus Christ, then here's the challenge, and listen to me. You are to live like Daniel so others can see in you the truth of who Jesus Christ is and what he has done for you. Go out, brothers and sisters in Christ. Live a life of integrity. And may people see, just like I saw in Daniel, the truth of who God is and how through the person of Jesus Christ, not only have we been saved and delivered from the den of lions, but so can they. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you so much for this passage. It is such a reminder to all of us, God, of the integrity of Daniel and how he lived, God, faithful before you. But Lord, as we have seen, the depth of this story goes deeper than Daniel. It is about the person of Jesus Christ. The Lord, all of us face the same thing like Daniel. We find ourselves in a den of lions that are seeking to destroy us, God. But because of Jesus Christ, when we place our faith and trust in him, we are saved, we are delivered from that, God. And we are forgiven, we are redeemed. And we have a future with you for eternity. I pray for everyone in this room today, they can say with certainty, God, that they have that peace that comes from knowing Jesus Christ no matter what they face. And Lord, may you commission them to go out and be modern day Daniels, that in the world that is full of darkness, may we all be beacons of light to show others there is hope in the person of Jesus Christ. We give this all to you for your glory and for your honor. In Jesus' name, amen.